My story begins right here in Warren. This is Burrs Hill Park. Anybody been to the park in Warren? It's right across from the town beach. Okay, beautiful little park, and my house is back in those trees there. But every morning when the leaves are off the trees, I get up and I look out and I can see the park. 2017, I see some commotion over the park. I go over there, they've got an excavator going. They're digging a hole in the park. I'm thinking, what is going on here? Well, come to find out that they were reburying the Massasoit Osamequin. Anybody know who the Massasoit Osamequin is? I'm sure you've heard of them. How many people have heard of Plymouth Rock? Let's start there. Okay, anybody who hasn't heard of Plymouth Rock? How many people remember that a year after, well, it's more like 4 months after they finally came ashore, that they met with the Massasoit, big statue over there, you know. His name is Osamequin. Massasoit is a title, means great leader. So it would be like calling him president. Well, he's not Massasoit, that's not his name. His name is Osamequin, but he's the Massasoit Osamequin. They met with him in 1621 on March 22nd. That's a significant date. Does anybody know what that period of time in the calendar means? March 22nd, 21st, right around there. Equinox. There you go. And we believe that's why he chose to meet with them then. He also wanted to keep a close eye on them because he was very concerned about the diseases that were brought by the Europeans 3 or 4 years before that, starting in about 1619, which wiped out 90% of the people living along the Massachusetts coast. I mean, we think we have a pandemic now, we lose 700,000 people, and that's tragic. But if that were equivalent numbers, imagine losing 220 million people, okay? That's what happened to them, which cleared the land and the place for the pilgrims to set up shop there, which they did slowly through that winter. You recall that half of them died, half of the 102 didn't survive that winter. But by spring, it looked like not only were they going to survive, but they were going to stay. And the native people here, does anybody know the name of the native people Massasoit and his tribe were called? Well, that's the name we always hear, is Wampanoag, okay? But that's a later name assigned, and I'll explain some of that later. But it was the Pokanokas, okay? And if you look at the Sellers map of 1629 or any of the other documents from that period, there's no question these were the Pokanokas. And if you read anything about the Massasoit, you learn that he was the Pokanoka chief, but also he had under him over 50 tribes that extended all the way up to the Charles River and into what is today Rhode Island, even the two islands, Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, were under his, you want to say under his rule or his authority. His authority came from people agreeing with him, okay? They didn't have elections, but you had to wield your influence by convincing people that you have the right judgment. And that's the position that Osamequin was in when the Pilgrims came. And he made a decision at that point. He had lost 90% of his warriors, okay? He was defenseless in a lot of ways. The Narragansetts were breathing down his neck over on Narragansett Bay and threatening to come in. They even actually chased him into a trading post in 1632. So he had to do something to keep the Narragansetts from moving into his territory. So he struck a treaty. Okay, and it's the treaty that, I don't know if I can get this to back up or not, but It's on the coin. Am I going the right way? Yeah, here we go. It's on this coin. If you get a Sacagawea dollar coin, you can get them. You have to buy them online now. More than $1. But on the back of them, of some of them, is the Wampanoag Treaty 1621. That's the only time the U.S. government has ever officially acknowledged that treaty. But it was the most important treaty in all of American history, because if that treaty hadn't been struck and kept, the English would have been sent packing, principally by the Narragansetts. Okay? And New England, Providence, Rhode Island, all that never would have happened. That treaty guaranteed the survival of the Pilgrims for over 50 years until Usamequin's death in 1661. And then things began to deteriorate at that point. But that was a very important treaty, the first treaty between a European power and Native people in America. So, going back to where I live, this is Warren. We're up here in Berkeley, right? But if you're familiar with this area, this was the area that Usamequin and his people occupied, called Sowams, S-O-W-A-M-S, okay? It's, again, a name that probably most of you haven't heard of. Unless you live in Barrington, there's Sowams Road, Sowams School, a couple of Sowams around there. But that was the land here in southern Massachusetts, you can't say southeastern, and was today Rhode Island, 40-some miles away from Plymouth. Usamequin got to meet with Ed Winslow and Governor Carver in Plymouth in 1621 by walking 42 miles. Not a big deal for them, okay? They walked all over the place. Right? They had runners. I swear they had runners who could run the 42 miles up and the 42 miles back in one day. Okay? Ed Winslow, when he came down with Steve Hopkins later in July of 1621, took him 2 days. Okay, just walking one direction. So, well oriented as to where we are here. Here we are in downtown Warren. This is Warrentown Hall. Next time you drive through Warren, you'll have plenty of time to look up at Town Hall because the traffic's so bad there, you have to stop. There's no way you can zoom through Warren. Okay? And if you look up there, you will see this, Psalm 1621. Warren was the home of the Massasoit, Usamequin, who welcomed the Pilgrims in 1621. And we just got the Warrentown Council to finally approve a land acknowledgement statement, and right out in front of Town Hall, we're just in the process of ordering it now. We'll have a marker that will explain that where Warren is now was occupied by people for how long? We say Warren goes back to 1747. That's not very long. I just got back from England in 1747. That's modern. How long were people living in this area? 5,000 years? 10,000. There you go. Possibly as long as 12, because the only thing that was in your way 12,000 years ago was a mile-high sheet of ice. Okay. So as soon as that ice sheet began to melt, people began moving into this area, and there's archaeological evidence that just found more in Connecticut recently, but at least 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, we have archaeological evidence that people were here. It's speculation before that. People moved around a lot, and these are not large numbers of people at that point in time. These are small bands of people who move from place to place, following the caribou and hunting. But Warren, somehow, we've tried to find out how, put up this frieze on the top of Warrentown Hall. We still don't know how it got there. We've tried to research it. But that explains where Sowams is, okay? And the 1621 date obviously refers to the meeting with this guy here. This is a sculptor named Dallin, who did a lot of Native American sculptures. He has one out in front of the Museum of Art in Boston, of the native on a horse sitting there with his arms back like this, looking up. Okay, that's Dallin. There's he did a number of sculptures, but this is probably the best known one, a depiction of what Usanikon might have looked like. So here we are back at the park. They were digging a hole that buried a 10 by 10 foot concrete vault, and the tribes from Mashpee came down because they had been collecting all of the things that had been buried in this park back prior to 1913, when Native people used this as a gravesite. Okay? The town librarian in 1913, Ed Parr, decided that rather than people just coming in and looting and taking everything out, he was going to dig everything up in a prescribed way. Dug up 42 grave sites and dispersed the items to various museums, including the American Indian Museum, A Museum in New York City, Harvard, of course, Heffenreffer in Bristol, and his own little museum in Warren on the second floor of the library. All of that stuff came out of graves. What does the 1990 Grave Reclamation Act of the U.S. government say about things taken out of native graves? They gotta go back. That's right. If somebody came and dug up your grandmother's grave and took things home, what would you think? Yeah, it's coming back. Okay, so that's exactly what happened, and they recovered over 600 items, buried it in a vault in the ground there, and put a stone marker over it that you can visit anytime. So that's my first introduction, really, having lived in Warren for nearly 40 years at the time, to the fact that the Massasoit Usanikon was right behind my house. I said, I got to learn a whole lot more about this. So I retired, fortunately, and began to do some research on this, began to look at this whole region here. You recognize this is what is now Bristol. Over here is now Barrington. This is Swansea here. This whole territory was occupied by Usanikon's people. And as we said, at least 10,000 years, until European explorers started showing up. About what time was that? Yeah, well, there's some possibility before Columbus that there were fishermen along here. We have no evidence of that, but clearly throughout the 1500s, there were explorers coming right and left. The native people here encountered them, learned about them. Some even learned the English language or French language. There were explorers that were not new. By 1620, the only thing that was new was that these explorers stayed and they brought women and children. So Usanikon said, this is different. Okay, these guys aren't coming for trade, these guys are coming to stay, and we better figure out what to do. So trading took place all throughout that, but we had close to 100,000 people, we think, living in New England at that time, native people. So this whole area, this process of trade was going on for quite some time, and quite successfully so. And as I mentioned a few moments ago, with the traders came disease. Why didn't the Europeans get sick? Yeah, they had immunity. They had grown up, for hundreds of years. There were all kinds of plagues in Europe, one thing after another. Some people died, but some people survived. And if you survived, then you were immune. And they were able to carry that immunity when they came across ships. Somewhere around 1616, the ships were moving fast enough that they were able to carry the infection with them and spread it. And that's what happened with what's called the Great Dying that took place. So Usamequin met. This is there are all kinds of fanciful depictions of various meetings. This is one of them. Notice the mountains here in Plymouth. You've all seen the mountains in Plymouth, right? That whole encounter started on March 22nd. They came back on April 1st to sign the deal, April Fool's Day, and to this day, many Native people will say that was a foolish thing that Usamequin did. We understand what his rationale was, and for a long time it worked to ally with the English. But the problem was it wasn't just 50 or 102 people on the Mayflower. In 1630, 10 ships came over, carrying over 1,000 people from England in one summer, and populated the Boston Harbor area, because that had really been cleared out. The Massachusetts natives had died. There were hardly any native people up there. So here you've got this whole flotilla of people moving into the area. And what happens when people are successful, get a house, maybe raise some crops and animals, maybe do some trading, one thing or another, and get married and have children? Okay, what's the problem with children? They grow up. And when they grow up, they have to live somewhere. So, do you give them your land? No. Yeah. Your land is what you've been working with, and that's the source of your income. You give them new land. Okay? So, generation after generation, starting in 1630, these English people were purchasing land all around the area. In the meantime, Usamequin's people were dying. Not only did they have a great plague in 1616 to 1619, but in the 1630, 1632 in particular, there was an outbreak of smallpox among the native people. Even more died. Their numbers were going down, the English numbers were going way up. Here's the treaty. We won't harm you, you won't harm us. If somebody tries to harm you, we'll defend you. Okay? Pretty simple 6-point treaty. It, of course, lastly, they had to declare King James their loyalty, but they fixed that later when King Philip and King Alexander got named. So the treaty lasted for years. It meant there was no warfare, and really at the beginning, a great deal of cooperation. The English people could not have survived without help from native people. First of all, the crops wouldn't grow. You take English wheat or oats and try growing them on bare New England soil, good luck. Okay, and that's without plows or horses or anything of that sort. But what did grow, and grow in great abundance here? Corn. Okay, which had only been imported. I always thought the native people here had corn for eons. Turns out it's only about 1300 that they began to bring corn into New England. Okay, so it wasn't that old. Even by 1600, they'd only had about 300 years of corn production. But it was enough corn production that they stopped having to move from place to place to place for their food supplies, and they were able to be more settled, because when you have agriculture, you're not dependent on fishing and animals for everything. And any hunters here know that if you hunt in one area over and over again, the game disappear. Okay, you got to move, right? And that's what they used to do. But now with corn, they could get through the winter without necessarily having to go hunt. Not that they wouldn't hunt, but they wouldn't have to move entire villages over and over and over again. Here's the coin. Here's our good friend Ed Winslow. he's an interesting character. I call him the Secretary of State of the we call them the Pilgrims. They weren't called Pilgrims in the 1800s. They're really the separatists, okay, who escaped from England for religious freedom, right? I just came back 2 weeks ago from England, where I went to Austerfield and Scrooby and Redfield and Gainsborough. Anybody been to any of those places here? Okay, that's where these folks came from. Okay, kind of eastern center England. Small farming villages that escaped the purview of the Queen at the time, Queen Elizabeth. And they were able to form small groups and meet in secret. And what was their secret? What did they want to do? Freedom from what? What did they not like about the church at that time?
Catholicism?
Yeah, Catholicism, but then the Anglicans adopted a lot of Catholicism, okay? They wanted to simplify religion. They wanted to take it back to the primitive religion that was described in the New Testament, okay? No churches, no statues, no stained glass, no synagogues, small meetings in homes, that's it, okay? That was their ideal. That's what they wanted to practice, and they tried that around central England for a number of years, always having to escape the authorities because that wasn't allowed. You couldn't meet outside of a regular church. So they eventually found a boat, picked them up in Gainsborough, outside of Gainsborough Town Hall, which is only a couple hundred yards away from the river, and snuck out in the middle of the night and tried to get all the way down out to the North Sea and over to Holland, where they knew they could worship with freedom. Well, somebody turned them in, they got caught, and then got jailed in Boston, England. Women were sent back, but then a year later they tried it again and succeeded. So they finally got over to Leiden, Holland, okay, and lived and worshiped there for about 10 years. But over that time, as their children were growing up, the kids were becoming more Dutch than they were English, okay, because they spent time with other kids. The colonists said, the separatists said, we have to go to another place. And they had heard about America and knew from some of the explorers that had landed in Virginia. Remember, Virginia was 1609. And there had been exploration along the coast, and including a map showing Cape Cod and the Plymouth area. So they knew what was here. They decided to get a couple ships, hire Captain Christopher Jones, and bring the Mayflower around from, when I was over there, I said, oh, let's go to Harwich. That's not how you say Harwich. It's Harwich. Yeah, you know about Harwich? On Cape Cod, it's Harwich, right? Yeah. Over there, it's Harwich. Just the way things are said. So they were able to get the ship. You know, they had the speedwell. There were going to be two ships, and the speedwell was leaking. They had to go back. Finally, crammed everybody on board, and went over. It took 2 months. 2 months, and they weren't allowed up on the open deck. They were in this cramped little 5-foot-high space. Anybody been on the, yeah, you can see exactly what it's like there, right? You go up to Plymouth anytime, I guess. They're still doing tours there, right? But a horrible experience, obviously, and only a group of committed people would ever make that journey. And they did, and one of them was Ed Winslow, and he played a leadership role. I'll mention over here that there was a big dispute, it was 100 years ago, about whether where Ed Winslow met Bruce Meekman was in Warren or in Barrington. And if you're in Barrington, of course, that's where Bruce Meekman was, as Tom Bicknell explained. Or if you're in Warren, Virginia Baker, who dedicated the spring on Water Street that you can see today, that was Massasoit Spring. Obviously, Massasoit was living next to the spring. Okay, so whether you agree with McNeil or with Baker, we know for sure that Ed Winslow walked the 42 miles and came down and met in Sabiquan in July after the treaty was signed in March with Baker. So all of that is well documented. We just did the 400th anniversary of that meeting in Warren. It's on the Sowams Heritage Area website. He came back again 2 years later when he had heard that Sabiquan was deathly ill and didn't know exactly what to do. In fact, they were afraid before they got there. They had heard news that he had died, but he hadn't. And they got there and found him, essentially comatose, and managed to revive him enough to get a little jelly in his mouth, and ordered a chicken for chicken soup, but didn't arrive in time. Whatever he did worked, and Sabiquan recovered, okay, and said, "I will be friends with you for life," and he was, okay. So that's probably the most significant event that happened in Sowams itself, and it's well described. Thankfully, most of the pilgrims wrote. They were all literate. Everybody had to read and write because you had to read the Bible, okay? So there was a lot of literacy, and they did a lot of printing. And Ed Winslow had been a printer over in England and sent a lot of his writings back to England where they were published because they wanted to promote people coming over to New England. And the way you do that is you tell good stories and people read them and say, well, I want to go there too. That's what he did. You have to imagine what Sowams and the settlement area for the native people might have looked like at that time. It's described by, remember, Verrazano came over in 1514. It came up to what we believe is Newport Harbor. Spent 2 weeks there. His men explored the area, okay, and described it as open for 60 leagues. That's between 60 and 90 miles of open, cleared land. How did that happen? I always thought when they got here it was virgin forest, huge oak trees, and nothing but that. How do you clear land when you're a native person? Burning. Okay. And they had been doing that for hundreds of years. Okay? They would burn off huge sections of open land so you could hunt better and you could grow corn. They had the whole place staked out and ready for the English. So when the English moved in, including people like our good friend Miles Standish, he bought land there. Never lived there, but he said, this is exactly what we're looking for. Remember, at that time, all the land in England was already taken, used, divided. All the good lumber had been cut, except for what the king had. It was not a good place to look for new farmland. But here, they found exactly what they were looking for. 1631, a guy from London decides that he's going to come over here. Anybody heard of Roger Williams? Roger's a very interesting guy, but he grew up in London, and I could do a whole thing on Roger Williams, but basically went to school there at the Charterhouse. As a boy, he lived just a few hundred yards from the square where they were killing dissidents, religious people who didn't believe what the king wanted them to believe, King Charles I, okay? And they would not just chop their head off, but they would torture them cut them open, rip their guts out, have them look at their beating heart while they're dying. I mean, just gruesome stuff. Of course, the same people came over and called the Indians here savages, but that's another story. So Roger grows up with all this, says England is in terrible shape. He didn't agree with what the church was doing. He wanted to start something new and different. Gets on a boat in 1631, comes over to Plymouth, and spends time in Plymouth and gets to know Usamequan. And if you know anything about Roger, you know he was a master of languages. He'd grown up, his father was a cloth merchant in London. And in order to get the best prices on imports of cloth that came into London, you go down to the docks, and you don't talk to the captain or the officials there. You start talking to the crew up on the ship. And you learn their language. If they speak Hindu or whatever language, you learn that and learn how to bargain with them. So before anything came off the ship, you already had your deal. Okay. He was a smart guy. And he used his ability to learn languages, to learn the language of the Poconokas here, and was very conversant with them before he left Plymouth. People in Plymouth didn't like his radical ideas either. You can read all about that. So he goes up to Salem, spends a couple of years there. They didn't like his ideas either. In fact, they didn't like him so much that the authorities in Boston said, you got to leave. You're going back to England. Okay. So in January of 1636, they send troops to go get Roger in his house in Salem and put him on a ship and take him back to England. Roger gets wind of this. He leaves and walks 90 miles from Salem down to Sowams to get help from Usamequan, his friend. In fact, we imagine that he must have had help from some of the native people along the way, because nobody could have survived. He was in terrible shape. This is a winter with 3-foot snowstorms, one of the coldest winters around in January 1636. He manages to stay alive and gets there. And Usamequan takes him to his winter settlement and shelters him in something that, I have a picture of it. Yeah, right here. Shelters him right here. That's Margaret's cave. This is just over the Warren-Swansea line and on private property, but the Roger Williams Family Association has put a marker there. And I take people on tours every now and then. If you're interested, let me know. But we were speculating about Roger being cared for by a native woman named Margaret. It's not her name. It's just a name that Margaret sounds was the closest English word to whatever the native name was. In any case, it's known as Margaret's Cave. It's not really a cave. It's just a shelter in the rock. You can put logs over here and build a fire under here and survive on a cold winter day. It protects you from the wind and one thing and another. And we kept thinking, they're not going to put Roger out in the middle of the woods for 14 weeks. That's not what you do with somebody who's your friend. They took him out here because this is where their winter settlement was. There was a whole village there. Okay? This is all speculation. We don't have any archaeological evidence, but it only makes sense that that's where the winter village is. And we've since had a painting, and I'll talk to you about that later, of what we think that winter village looked like at that time. So here's Roger out there. He recovers after 14 weeks, and then goes up to Omega Pond, East Providence. You'll probably never find it because here's the monument. It's set way back away from the street, and there's one little tiny sign up on a telephone pole that says Roger Williams Spring. And you go, where is it? We're going to put a new marker right down here where you can read it. But basically, that was the place where he settled. Across the street from this is Omega Pond. It's now a pond that at the time it was open to the Seacombe River, so it's really an inlet there, and he was able to travel from there. A couple of the 17th century houses right nearby. But that worked out fine. He got his crops planted. He brought his wife and small baby child down, and a few of his friends from Salem. And next thing you know, our good friend Ed Winslow says, "Sorry, you're on Plymouth land. You've got to go across the river. We can't let you stay here." So after your crops are starting to grow, and now you got to leave. Okay, crazy. So we went across the river and founded Providence. That if you're anybody from Rhode Island, what cheer top, right? Does that mean anything to you? No. It's look on any city vehicle. What cheer top? Okay. That was the greeting that Canonicus, the chief of the Narragansetts, because now Roger was in Narragansett territory, gave to Roger and his friends when they crossed the Seekonk River. It simply means, hello, friend. Okay. So Roger sets up a town, is outside of Plymouth territory, so he ends up having to go back to England to get his own charter from the king, because he was not an approved territory. The only evidence of this is a painting of what the settlement along this would be North Main Street in Providence right now, and this great salt pond here. Anybody go to Waterfire? Yeah. Well, that's in this water right here. It's greatly changed. Okay. Ever since Buddy redid the city, you won't recognize it. But if you look around, you can see the different parts and what happened. The one thing you can point to from the 17th century is the Weybosset Bridge at the bottom of College Hill. That's the 8th version of the bridge across the same place. It's the narrow place where you can cross from the West Bay to the East Bay without having to get wet. Well, you get your legs wet because you have to wade across at low tide, but you didn't have to have a boat to get across, okay? You could drive your paddle across from one to another. So there were wooden bridges of all kinds there, a whole series of them. Finally, this is the latest version. We know that bridge is there because Roger was a toll taker for a while. He wasn't a minister, he didn't have a church, he didn't have any other occupation. He wrote a lot, but nobody bought any of his books. So he had to have a job, so he was a toll taker there. It worked. And if you go to this is the little interpretation house at the other end of Roger Williams National Memorial. You get the whole story about Roger in the video and the whole thing. But he was an important person. There's also a big controversy going on now about a statue for William Blackstone. Roger wasn't the first guy in Rhode Island. He came a year after William Blackstone. It was Blackstone, not Stone, who came from England before 1630. Don't quote me on the date on that. Basically, Boston Common was his land, okay? And he lived on Beacon Hill when it was a hill, okay? 1630, 1,000 people show up. I'm not staying here, okay? He came over for peace and quiet. You get 1,000 English people, you leave. So he rode his white ox, brought his 400 books, and traveled down to Blackstone Valley, Cumberland, Rhode Island. He's had monuments there, but they kept getting moved because they kept building Ann and Hope and other things there, whatever. And they lost his bones finally. So just this year, somebody decided to put a statue of Bill Blackstone riding his horse. It's a modern aluminum statue kind of thing. But there's a guy up, holding a book while he's riding an white ox. Anyway, well, there's been a lot of pushback just in the last few weeks from, in principle, principally the Narragansett tribe, saying, here's an English settler who's coming in here to take over our land. Why would you celebrate him? You're tearing statues down all over the country. This guy's up to no good. Well, we don't know for sure whether he had slaves. The likelihood is that he at least had indentured people who worked for him. He couldn't carry 400 books by himself. So we had people. Okay. So there's that slight claim. But their main point is that here's another case of English people coming in and invading our territory without our permission. Okay. And that's true. He never got a deed, never talked to Canonicus, anything of that sort. At least Roger was well known for saying we don't just take land. We pay for it, but just to correct that, it's not, people say, oh, you paid $23 for this, huge tract of land. No, he had gifts. The native way, first of all, do native people own land? No. Okay. You use and take care of land. You don't own it. God owns land. Okay? You're just there to use it, and respectfully so. So when the English started presenting these deeds, it was like, what is this? Oh, this must be a statement that you can use it to travel or fish or hunt or grow crops or one thing or another. No, the English said, no, it's exclusively ours and you stay out. Total mismatch in terms of the two cultures there. But Roger at least did an exchange of gifts. It's a tribute you do. It's like a celebration. If you give an award to somebody, you give them a nice gift at the time. That's the same idea. It's not that the gift is the value of it. It's just a way to exchange. So there's Roger dealing in a better way. He's still an external interloper and a guy who's threatening the native culture there. And then a few years later, in East Providence, which was then called Rehoboth, the Newman Church people come. They came down from Weymouth, about 40 of them, and decided to settle. This is the current Newman Church on Newman Avenue in East Providence. Rumford, you familiar with that area? Okay. The church building isn't from 1643, but the group that established the church, this is the fourth building, started in 1643. A few of them are buried across the street. And there's William Carpenter has a gravestone there. It's just a shaft of rock, just says WC on it. That's all you get. But that was the first real settlement of any kind in Sowams of English people, and that was a marker of what was to come. Remember, this is 20 years after Plymouth, and now you got 40 people come down, and before you know it, 40 become 400, and the growth there continues. In fact, they set up what's called the Ring of the Green around the church. You see that over there? Okay. It's basically these house lots set up around a large green in the center, the church in the center. And what do you use the green for? Livestock, right. And why do you have to put your livestock in the green at night? Either stolen or killed by wolves or, what have you. So it's a way to protect them. They would be on your land the rest of the time, but at night they go in. And then you pay somebody to stay up all night and chase out whatever. Okay? So that's the ring of the green, and every house lot you see was, like spokes in a wheel. So everybody had a gate that could go into the green, and you notice here, most people had direct access to water, because there's a 10-mile river over there, another little piece of it down there, and a river all along there, and a river there. What a great setup there. Talk about community development planning. This is a good deal. Unfortunately, none of the houses from that time survived, because what happened in 1675? A little skirmish. Okay, called the Pink Gulf War. I'll tell you about that in a second here. You can, if you get over to East Providence, stop by Hunt's Mills. You'll go by on Pawtucket Avenue. There's a little sign there. You drive in, you think, where am I going? And you get to the back of it, and there's the 10-mile river flowing like every day like that. I mean, it's just, you can't hear somebody talking standing next to you because the water's rushing there. Okay, it's an amazing place. It was dammed up years ago, and then the first mills were built there in the 1640s. That's the English way, right? If you want to have flour, you got to grind your grain. If you want to weave cloth, you got to have a loom, etc. So you can still see those remnants of the 17th century right there. Not far from there, Rehoboth. I'm sure some of you have been to Rehoboth, right? Rehoboth, the place that you never know where you are. Good thing for GPS, because I'd never find anything. And it's interesting. I talked to Lindy at the Carpenter Museum, a great little museum. You should go there. She grew up there, and she said, when I was a little kid, I could see everything. There were no trees. All the trees that you see in Rehoboth today have grown up in the last 50 years. All right? That's what happens when you stop farming and you just let the trees grow. And now you can't see a thing. The roads are like tunnels. Anyway, there were settlements there in Rehoboth as well, including settlements that blockhouses that we used for protection when the war started. So, very briefly, how are we doing on time? I'm probably at the first hour. Does anybody have to leave? Give me another 20 minutes and I'll finish up here. How's that? Okay? I don't see anybody squirming too much here. If you need to stand up, take a break, that's fine. So here's a map I did of this whole area, and what you have, we're up here in Berkeley, up here. This is Bristol. Used to be called Consumptive Neck. Okay. What you have were English settlements that had formed all the way around there, and leaving the Bristol Neck as the only place where Winslow and the Poconoke people could live unfettered. Okay, it was their only land. It shrunk to this huge area. And their population shrank from about 7,000 people down to about less than 700. Okay? So you've got settlements up here in Providence and on the Runners River, and in Tuisset and Warren, there's a whole settlement. Swansea, of course, and then down in Newport. They were surrounded by English people, right? Losing their own population year after year, and having lost nearly all their land. Well, what does that sound like? If you're surrounded and you're shrinking, what's going to happen next? You're going to be gone, huh? And Winslow second, youngest son, Philip, had a comet, which is his real name. Decided that they'd have to do something or they would lose their entire culture, period. That would be it. It'd be wiped out. We'd be talking about the vestiges of the Poconoke tribe that don't exist anymore. They're gone. English took over. A few remaining ones died of disease, and that was it. So the war broke out. Right on Child Street, if you're coming into Warren, right at the Kickamoot River there, we located the farm where the first skirmish took place, and then it proceeded. The English militia came down to the Niles garrison just north of there, tried to chase Atacama and Philip down to Bristol. He had escaped and ended up going all the way up to Northampton and that area in Massachusetts. And one by one, they were burning villages. What were they trying to do? Get the land back. And how do you get your land back after a lot of people have taken it? You get rid of those people. And, yes, people died. But if you look at their warfare strategy, they would come in and set fire to buildings, okay, and kill animals, cows, pigs, chickens, whatever. But they weren't attacking people. I mean, the idea wasn't to just go in and slaughter people. the idea was to get the English to leave. And they did. A lot of them, after the war broke out, either went down to Newport, and some of them got on ships and went back to England. Things had changed in England. It wasn't so bad over there in America. But that strategy to get your country back by getting the invaders out was what that was all about. And I think it's the only reasonable way to understand that war. So here's the course of the war all the way up into Massachusetts, and I could spend 2 more hours talking about the war, and I won't. There's lots, probably most things are written about the King Philip War. Unfortunately, they don't write much about the peace of 50 years beforehand or what happened to the native people afterwards, which was that most of them were either killed outright. If you're 14 years old and male, you could be shot on sight. If you spoke the Pokanoket language, you could be killed. If you said you were Pokanoket, you could be killed. So you didn't want to live there. And they essentially moved everybody out. A lot of the Pokanoket people that I work with today survived by joining other tribes like the Narragansetts in Connecticut. And that's where they, through the families, they were able to keep their culture alive. But in Sowams, they were gone. There was nobody left in Bristol, Warren, Barrington, wherever. During the war, the English, you can see these monuments, one for the Miles garrison. Miles was a preacher who broke away from the Weymouth group in East Providence for a little bit of time. And he was brought over from Wales and became a minister there, but the church was burned, everything was burned. All the English houses in this area were burned. And Philip, who was Usabiquin's son, who took over, there's a whole lot that I could tell you about that, but he was finally captured in Bristol, right near his home on Pope. And there's a marker there where he was shot and drawn and quartered, in usual typical fashion. You can also go to Anawan Rock, and up there on Route 44, and climb around there. And that's where Anawan, Philip's chief war captain, met with Benjamin Church, and spent a night swapping war stories, and then they sent him up to Plymouth and Mahoney. So today you can, I'll just go through these quickly. These are various grave sites and one thing or another around. Some of the farms. There's a farm in North Warren. It's a King's Grant farm from before 1700. Places, these are mostly in Barrington. You still find places that look essentially unchanged from 400 years ago. You drive on Route 136. If you know Johnson's Market on Route 136, just before you get into Warren, if you look off to one side, you'll see this large rock here, and then on the other side you'll see a perched rock or balanced rock. See how it's balanced there. The state archaeologist says, "Oh, that's just a glacial rag." No, Tim. People put that there. There's the rocks that are keeping it there. Well, it could have been some drunk college students. No, Tim. Any college students have better things to do than roll 3-ton rocks around. Okay? That's a balanced rock. It's a native sacramental rock, a ceremonial rock. So we're doing our work to make sure that each of these places are identified. Because for a civilization that's been here for 10,000 years, it's hard to find things. You have to go in places like Dighton Rock to find things that were around here before 400 years ago. You know what I mean? Good thing we have rocks. So Bristol was laid out, the whole town there, you've all seen it. And, here's the oldest house in Bristol, still there. It was built with wood brought over from England, 1680. It's unfortunately not preserved. It's like apartments right now. But that is the oldest house, and the church then was built for that. So Bristol got established. There's some items from the church. Some more 17th century houses in Bristol. Here's houses, this is in Warren, 1680 or so, over in Barrington. Other one in Swansea. So if you go on the website, Sowams Heritage Area, and you'll see houses, what do you call them? First period houses. And I'll have a whole list, description, maps, the whole thing. I'm not going to worry with all those details. But here we are back in Warren, where we started. This is the vault where the burial items were placed. These are some of the Mashpee tribe who were in that park behind my house for 2 days and celebrating and doing. I mean, this was a very important time for them to return those items. This is sacred land, and we're continuing to work with the Okanoka tribe to help not only protect it, but help people understand what it is. So I think I will stop there. I see one question about to come up, and not too bad, 10 minutes over. But I'd be happy to take questions.
I just wanted to ask about the burial vault. Did they document or photograph the items that they placed in that vault?
We don't know exactly, because the tribe won't tell us. But a lot of the items that were taken out were documented, and they're in a book written by Susan Gibson in 1980. It's about 150 pages with photographs, black and white photographs, of many of the items that came out of the gravesite. She went to the museums where things were and documented them there. The reason for that, you think, oh, what's the pictures of bones? No. They buried people with things that they were going to take to the next life. And a lot of the things that they valued highly were European products. Okay, ceramics from Holland, tools from England, things of that sort. So that's what most of the documentation is about. In fact, we had some of those things at the little library in Warren. My wife was a librarian at the time when the tribe came to take their things back, and she and I packed stuff up, so I'm quite familiar with what came out of those grave sites. But that's now all underground, and where it should be. Other questions? Have I convinced you of everything?
The generations now of descendants.
Yes.
Are they around?
Well, I've been working with the tribe for about 3 years, and they hadn't ever put a written history of what happened to them together. But we developed a study committee appointed by the town council, and had the tribe historian research and write up a 4-page description of what happened after the war. That's what I was saying. Nobody talks about what happened after the war, in which he details how the families survived and how they went to the Chautauqua Reservation in Connecticut, eastern Connecticut. They couldn't self-identify as Poconoket, so nobody knew they were there. And they had tribal leaders from other tribes who were over them, all of that. Gradually, many of them worked their way back into the Providence area, okay? And because that's where the jobs were. And there's a whole group of people living in one of the housing developments in South Providence. And there's a book now that just came out in the past year by Pat Rubatone from Brown University called Native Providence. You get it at a library. Don't try to buy it. It's $80. But she went back and detailed all the different families in Providence who were all native families living in the city, mostly 100 years ago or so. So there is a good deal of documentation about what happened. So basically, like many people who could not come forward with their real identity, just kind of merged into the crowd, if you will. In many cases, they would say, "Oh, I'm Portuguese." So, okay, you know, but they were native and they kept within the families, they kept their native heritage. So you can read that on the Town of Warren website, history, click here, it's all there. Any other questions? I'm curious as to how all this relates to what goes on here. Sure.
Many years ago, I discovered the burial ground of Benjamin Church in Little Compton, Rhode
That's
Island.
right.
Yeah, and
Yep.
they had a farm not too far from the
Quite well marked there,
I thought it was very
and lots of
impressive.
nice things said about him and one thing or another. Then if you go to Bristol, there's Benjamin Church Manor and one thing.
Yeah.
If you're English and you won the war, you get noticed, okay? If you're native and you lost the war, they don't know where you are. Other questions? A couple more here.
The Heffenrecker Museum, is that closed?
Yes. Brief story on the Heffenrecker is that Rudolf Heffenrecker came over from Germany, one thing led to another. He established the Narragansett Beer Company. That's the thing most people know about. He had a lot of money. Okay. In the turn of the century or so, he began collecting native objects and built his own museum on his property at Mount Hope that he had purchased. There used to be an amusement park there, and he bought the land. Well, because you could take the steamships from Fall River across, and that's what people did on Sunday. But Rudolph donated his land, his family, when he died, donated the land to Brown University. And they maintained his museum, expanded it some, built another barn there, one thing or another, and had people, you could come and visit and things of that sort. About 7 or 8 years ago, they closed because of fire regulations. They didn't have means of egress or whatever. So it hasn't been open since then. And the tribe is working very hard now to get around to give up that land. They're leaving. They're taking their museum to Providence. So in about 1.5 years, they won't be there anymore. And that land is sacred land and should go back to the tribe. So if any of you want to help us get that land back, we've got a strong effort going on with Brown to do the right thing.
Every year where Metacom is wrapped.
Yeah, the land where Metacomet was captured is part of Mount Hope Farm, which is 300 acres that are part of that peninsula there. And you can go visit the farm, and you can walk to that monument. You can also go to King Philip's seat, but you have to get permission to get around. Even the tribe can get to that.
So, do you know what kind of evidence there was that there were people here, like 10,000 years ago, the very first people?
Yeah. Oh, there's all kinds of archaeological stuff. Probably the most well-known is Bull Brook, which is north of Boston. But you go on the website, there's a whole thing on archaeology. There are many dozens of digs around, and they're doing more all the time. Basically, you have a civilization that's here for 10,000 years. Literally millions of people having lived here, okay, over time, all right? All the artifacts are anywhere from 2 to 6 feet below the surface of the ground, okay? So that's what happens over time. I didn't realize that just in a century, you build up dirt, okay? And a couple centuries, you build up a lot of dirt. You know, it's there, and anytime if they're going to build a highway extension or put a new bridge in, and they bring in the excavators and start digging, well, they have to give the archaeologists time to go look, and they keep finding them. So it's literally under our feet. Any other questions? No?
You said that Osawego,
Yeah.
Rhode Island, Warren, Bristol. Wasn't he also like in the Plymouth County, Fall River area?
No.
Massachusetts?
His home settlement ended at the Taunton River. Okay. That's why Sowams, if you go back, I don't know if I can get that map again, but if you go back to the map that you have in the middle of your brochure there, it doesn't include Fall River. That was Pocasset land, another tribe.
Oh.
Okay. And then down in Tiverton, you have the Saconets. okay, another tribe. There were 60 tribes all around. The Pokanoka tribe was in Sowams, but Osumikon led all the tribes in the region. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. Any other questions? This is the tribe today, by the way. You go in the grocery store and you see somebody who's native and you would have no idea they're a native. They have to tell you, okay? And there are about 300. Yep.
Actually, tomorrow is what we always call Columbus Day.
Oh, yeah,
And indigenous people, it's indigenous people's day.
that's right.
now. So,
Well, 18 towns have already adopted that. The president just declared it yesterday, right? Yeah.
I hear that.
Yeah. Well, we're not taking away Columbus Day, we're just adding Indigenous Peoples Day, largely because Indigenous people do not see Columbus as a hero. If you read, if you do any research, you find out Columbus wasn't Italian, he was Portuguese. Okay. Anybody here Portuguese? All right. Got a new guy to claim. Okay. But some interesting stuff, and you're going to hear more and more. So go on the website. There's over 500 pages to explore. I think it's my email somewhere. It's grweed@cox.net. If you have any questions, and Nancy can always get you in touch with me. Right?
Thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Very good.